The recording did not work. Right, now it is. Welcome, folks, to this panel discussion in response to the movie Disclosure, which came out about 2 months ago. I think it's a really wonderful film if you haven't seen it yet. I know a lot of folks who are tuning in have seen it. And I think earlier before we started recording, we were talking about history and making history. And I think in another really important way in the field of trans representation, in the field of cinema, of Hollywood, of cultural work, Disclosure is another bit of history being made. And as theologians and as artists and as ministers and cultural workers and activists, our role is to engage history, to be there in history, to learn from history, and to understand what history is speaking to us, to follow it, to learn from it, and to see how the sacred is conveyed through history. My name is Max Brumberg-Kraus. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns, and I'm an alum of United, and I'm so excited to welcome this great, fantastic, amazing group of panelists who will, in a bit, have a little more time to introduce themselves, but I'll give some quick intros. First off, we have Nick Adams, who's the Director of Transgender Media Representation at GLAAD, and is also featured in Disclosure. Yay! We have Reverend Deborah J. Hopkins, founder and executive director of There's Still Hope in Charlotte, North Carolina. Leigh Finke, founder of Totally Gay Productions, producer, writer, documentary filmmaker, and journalist from St. Paul, Minnesota. And Justin Sabia-Tanis, assistant professor and director of social transformation at United. This is a really exciting group of people. Thank you so much for coming here. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So the first question that I want to ask you all is really around why disclosure? Why is disclosure important for you and your work? So as part of this answer, if you could say a little bit about where you are located, what you are doing, any of that sort of information that you think is relevant, and then what does disclosure mean for you in your context? And I will go based on the order on my screen. So Reverend Deborah Hopkins, you're the first on my screen.
Why not? Why not? First of all, good evening to all of you. I hope that you all are safe, staying hydrated, and dealing with 2020 circumstances the best that you can. May God bless you, continue to give you strength, wisdom, and guidance as you continue to navigate through these troubled waters. I am the founding pastor of Essentials for Life Ministries, which is an online ministry here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that focuses on the destruction of the LGBT community in terms of their faith walk. And I try to promote through my online ministry a message of hope and love, strength and trust in the Creator in a way that will make a difference in their lives to move forward. I also am the founding director of a nonprofit organization called There's Still Hope, which is very close to my heart. It focuses on homeless transgender adults that our homeless systems around the country have failed to fully recognize and provide the care within our homeless community, which is a pandemic in itself. But it is even escalated among our transgender adults and youth and children around the country. And so we focus on trying to address that. And the pandemic of 2020 has caused me to see 24 clients and have provided what was normally supposed to be a short-term program, turning into an extended stay where we've actually been housing people for anywhere from 3 to 4 months now on a given period of time. And, you know, it's interesting because with this documentary coming out, I've had an opportunity to see it on 2 separate occasions. And it spoke very powerfully to me in terms of the work of truth and justice in terms of the fight for equality. And I believe it to be very central to the work that I'm doing to provide and bring awareness to the homeless, within the homeless community, amongst our politicians who write the laws and set the foundation around us to be able to make a difference. And I really do believe that through this documentary, which is very accurately told, I'm old enough to be able to be a witness, if you don't mind, to the very story and the truth in which this documentary depicts. And I am so embracing it because I'm telling people in different circles the importance of at least doing a film festival that features this documentary, and to have ample space for real Q&A and getting the public and the viewers' point of view and assessment on it, because I really think it has a message that is powerful and that's going to make real differences in the lives of those who are viewers of this, and will continue to strengthen the fight for equality, whether it's in the house of faith and worship, in our school systems, in the workplace, and our moving around the country.
Great, thank you so much. So now on my screen is Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin Sabia-Tanis. I'm assistant, hello, assistant professor of social transformation. I direct the social transformation program here at United Theological Seminary. And I realized that the panelists, in some way, I could tell my history backwards. So Leigh is someone I've been delighted to meet as part of my work here at United, where we've looked at her amazing films that address questions like white supremacy in the church and gender and sexuality issues. And then moving back prior to that, I used to work at the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, working on LGBTQ activism in faith communities. And as part of that work, I went to Charlottesville, Virginia, and we'd met before, but I got to work with Reverend Hopkins, and we were on the at a conference on pastoral care for LGBTQ people. And then many years long ago, when I transitioned back in the 1990s, beginning from then, I've been friends with Nick Adams, who I'm really delighted to have here. So to be on a panel with such amazing colleagues tonight is really a pleasure for me. So as I said, I am transgender. I'm a trans man. I transitioned over 20 years ago, and have been active as a theologian, as an activist. I wrote a book on transgender theology. I've worked in Washington, D.C. at the National Center for Transgender Equality, doing advocacy for trans folks, and in addition to teaching and writing about issues of gender and sexuality. I will say that, and I'm sure we'll have time to get more into this, but I would say one of the things that disclosure means to me is I've thought a lot about what does it mean as a trans person to make visible that the truth that we know about ourselves, right? So that being able to show on the outside things that we know to be true about ourselves, whether it's through our clothing or through physically related transitions, other things. It really is about this process of unveiling to the world the authenticity of who we are. And what I love about disclosure is that very act of disclosure and the truth telling that is there, both about the ways in which we've been misrepresented, but also the ways in which people are coming forward to powerfully represent our community. And I think there's something very holy about this process of disclosing our full selves to the world. And I celebrate that in this film and in the conversations we'll be having.
Thank you, Justin. Yep, we will talk more about that. Next on my screen is Leigh.
Hi. My computer's frozen. Can you see me?
I cannot.
I can. Oh, there I might be.
No,
Sorry about that. I will leave my camera on from now on. My name is Leigh Finke. I am a media producer and author from St. Paul, Minnesota. I have, as Justin mentioned, I have made 2 documentary films, White Savior, Racism in the American Church, and Ending the Silence, Confronting Sexual Shame in the Church. Those are both available on Amazon for folks who are interested. I also have a couple of books coming out that are available August 25th. They have long titles. You can Google my name if you want to find them. But my work is really in media creation and advocacy, especially around young people, young queer people, and young religious people who are exploring their queer identities. So I think that disclosure is extremely close to the work that I do. I mean, not just as a documentarian, it's an admirable and wonderful film that I very much appreciated, but also regarding the issues of representation, which is work that I am actively engaging in. I am trying to provide help, as we all are, of course, but trying to provide that representation through books and films to people who are seeking it. And as for the film, I mean, I found the movie very difficult. The first time that I watched it, it took several, small segments at a time because I had a hard time going back and watching those Ace Ventura clips and returning to some of these stories in the media. But it was very powerful, and of course, it's one of the messages of the movie is that as representation increase, so do the risks attached with transness, and I think that that's an inherent and important conflict that that the film sort of is diving into. That even as we are more visible and more celebrated, we are also facing additional risks to that. So that's just something that I wanted to mention right from the top.
Thank you. Yeah, for those who haven't seen it and who would like to, it can be really triggering. It can be really hard to watch. Hollywood has not always mostly been great in its depictions of the trans experiences. Nick, you are next on my screen.
Yes, hello. I'm Nick Adams. I'm the Director of Trans Representation at GLAAD. As Justin mentioned, I met Justin in, I think, July 1997. And then I started working at GLAAD in March of 1998. And I met Justin at my very first transgender support group meeting. So I'm also a transgender man. And the whole time I've been at GLAAD, which is 22 and a half years now, I've been trying to work with the media to help them do a better job of telling transgender stories. And that work didn't really get interesting until about 6 years ago, because for about 15 years, it was just a slog where the media didn't really want to talk to me. So I did lots of other things at GLAAD, ran the GLAAD Media Award nominations process and a bunch of things, because there was just Hollywood was not interested. There would be little interesting things that would happen, like the first trans character on Degrassi or Chaz Bono on Dancing with the Stars, but then everything would just go back to the way it was before and nothing ever changed. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, with the premiere of Orange is the New Black, and then Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine, and then Transparent on Amazon, and then Caitlyn Jenner, it was very clear that starting in about 2013, 2014, a giant sea change was starting to happen in terms of the media's interest in telling trans stories. So we took all the other jobs off my plate at GLAAD, and now I just work with Hollywood. Everybody from like networks executives to showrunners to writers' rooms to casting directors to actors to PR and marketing people, just trying to be a resource to them to help them do a better job of telling trans stories, because now everybody wants to tell trans stories, but they're still all just cisgender people who've largely not met a trans person. So so it's quite challenging, but very interesting and never dull. And what disclosure means to me is like many, many things, as you can imagine. One of them being mortified of seeing myself on camera, because that's not what I like. But more importantly for me, even though I know it has impact in a lot of different ways, I had one very clear thing that I wanted it to do, which was reach the people in Hollywood who are making the decisions about trans representation and creating those representations. Because when I have these meetings with people, whomever it is, they usually are very well-intentioned people. They want to do the right thing. That's why they've come to GLAAD. They're not bad people. They're not trying to be transphobic. But trying time and time again, every script I would get or everything they would bring me and every idea was just regurgitating the tropes and cliches of the past, because they didn't even know they were tropes and cliches. Like, they were raised on all that information. So and they'd never met a real trans person. So everything in their head is what they learned from film and TV. So it's been this like self-reinforcing cycle of like, you learn about trans people from film and TV, and then you turn around and put those same cliches and tropes into what you create, and then and there was nothing breaking that cycle. So I have been breaking the cycle a little bit in one meeting at a time everywhere I go, but it was like slow going. So I'd hoped that disclosure would reach these decision makers and give them a crash course on the stereotypes and tropes and cliches of the past, so that they would know not to do them again, even when they're a well-intentioned person. And what's been really great about that is that in the 2 months or 6 weeks since it came out, every email I get, every phone call I get, every meeting that I go into with people in Hollywood, they've all watched Disclosure. And so it's kind of mind-boggling that they're already like 7 steps ahead of where we would have been to start the conversation if they hadn't watched it. So it's this tremendous time saver. I don't have to explain to them why Silence of the Lambs and Dressed to Kill and all these horrible things were so horrible. They already get it. And I think the other piece of it for me too is that the one thing that Disclosure does has taught all those people the history of the film clips and everything. But there's so many people, even in liberal LA, which is where I live, who've never met a trans person. But when they watch Disclosure, they sort of feel as if they've met 30 trans people, because there are 30 trans people interviewed in the documentary. So they want to talk to me about like Marquise Wilson and Sandra Caldwell and all of these amazing people that they get to see in the film. And that also seems to be helpful to them. Like Justin mentioned, kind of just seeing real trans people speak authentically about the way those images impacted us, our families, the people who love us, also seems to resonate with people as much as the clips themselves and learning the history lesson of the transphobic representation. So that was my goal personally, of like working with the filmmaker and being in the film, and it exceeded kind of all my expectations, to be honest, in that regard, even though I know it has a lot of other audiences and ramifications as well.
Thank you. And that's so wonderful to hear how much it's already how useful it is. Like, it's not just, oh, this is entertainment. Obviously not. It's like a really powerful tool and a way to give access both to so many trans people to tell their experience and stories, and also to people who are in bubbles where there are not trans people to actually hear. So that's really, really wonderful. And I mean, and also as someone who has plenty of trans people in my life, it was also wonderful to hear people who are in conversation and in that world and the media world in Hollywood talk about their experience, because that's something that I don't hear a lot about, and a lot of us don't. I guess I'll say a little bit also just my context, just to be upfront with why I'm helping to organize this event, is that I'm an alum of United in Theology and the Arts, and I help a lot with the Theology Arts program. This event is funded by the Theology and the Arts program. And I think one of the core pieces of that program is this question of, whenever we encounter art, what do I see, or what do you see? Before I can think too much about what I'm feeling, what I'm learning, connecting the dots, there's the encounter with the art. And this idea of vision, of seeing, is so critical to this documentary, to the narratives in it. And one thing that I see encountering disclosure is a wide range of people, a racially, gender, career, like what their jobs are. And that's something I don't personally see a lot of. And I'm curious about that multiplicity, and about the sort of impetus in the documentary itself to say there needs to be trans people who are not just playing one kind of role, and also who are not only acting, but are producing, but are writing, but are at these different levels. So I'm curious if anyone wants to speak to that experience of the importance of trans media producers, of trans cultural makers in telling trans stories. What do you see differently when that happens, might be a way to phrase it.
Well, I want to hear from Leigh, because Leigh is a media content creator, which I am not. But I will just say briefly that the conversation is changing so fast in Hollywood, at least, about what trans representation means. I mean, just it seems like yesterday there was fights about whether or not trans actors should play trans parts. And now that's kind of a solved issue, honestly. I can't imagine a major media company today not making the decision to cast a trans person to play a trans role. So we kind of won that battle, which is amazing. And there's nuances to that to sort out and very complicated little details, but in general, we won that battle. And the conversation has now really turned to having trans people behind the scenes and helping to create the content, and not just getting a slice of the pie, but being in the kitchen to cook the pies. I stole that from Rain Valdez. And that is something GLAAD is 100% supportive of. And so I am there when they need help, because they don't have anybody in the kitchen. But my next thing is to say to them, like, you need to hire a trans person to be a producer, to be a writer, to be a director, to be something behind the scenes to make the story authentic, because we are still just basically improving right now what a cisgender person's conception is of what it means to be trans, as opposed to hearing actually from trans people the stories from our point of view. Like that, we haven't even scratched the surface of that yet. So it is right now starting to happen in Hollywood, where that's starting to change, but it's so new. But in 5 years, it's going to look really different.
Yeah, I think this is Leigh, and the question makes me think, and some of what you were saying, Nick, about towards the end of the film, when MJ Rodriguez is talking about what it feels like to make Pose. And as a trans person who's watched and seen, all the trans representation there is, which is not a great deal, you can just taste that Pose is different, right? It's different. It's baked into the bread. It just means something different when you're watching a story, and behind the camera, in front of the camera, from the beginning of that production, there were trans people. And when we're telling our own stories, those stories are going to feel different than when they're told by people who are not trans, no matter what their intentions are, no matter how good Eddie Redmayne's performance is. Like, it's not going to feel, it's never going to be the thing that it would be were trans people on camera performing and being behind the camera. So I think to me, it's just, not to use think of like a baking metaphor, right? Like it's the yeast versus like, well, we can put a little something on the top, no, it's foundational. And when it's foundational, you can just tell. At least I think trans people can just tell. Maybe other folks can't.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let me chime in, because the documentary itself was quite moving and very accurate in a lot of ways. But I'm still troubled by the fact that Hollywood and television at large is still just scratching the surface of accurately depicting the stories of true trans lives that are lived on a day-to-day basis. although disclosure covers monumental grounds, I still think that we're scratching that surface. We're still not addressing the realness of the trans experience, the trans journey, the trans lives of ordinary trans people who are going through the day-to-day lives. This is more of this is a Hollywood version, so to speak, a television version of the life and the stories surrounding the lives of trans people, whether it's the trans life struggling as a beautician or a prostitute trying to earn a living because the other factions have closed their doors to them. These are very real stories. These are very true stories, but I still think it's just scratching the surface because there's so much more. I know it was somewhat mentioned in disclosure of the struggle centered around housing, adequate health care, even to the point of the very essence of fear that many trans individuals who have not fully transitioned or were unable financially to fully transition in what their mind's eyes see is a great fear within amongst many trans who have to go to see their primary care physician, or God forbid they be in an accident and they find themselves rushed to the emergency room. And we saw a piece of it in disclosure, looking up under the gown and changing their identity from one to another, all because of what they saw underneath. There are more there's some deep stories behind all of this. And I just know that we're still just scratching the surface. We're scratching the surface because it's still not being told fully accurately in our places of worship. We're still trying to whitewash the truth behind the very essence of what the real life of a trans person is living and going through and having to navigate from day to day. And so it's I know we've made great strides, and I am so supportive of what GLAAD has been doing, and I am so glad of what my film writers and producers who are inviting the trans community into the community to be able to tell the story more accurately, because that's the only way we're going to be able to get this accurate account from the misperception that has been laid by Hollywood for decades to be told truthfully, accurately, and authentically in a way that's really going to help change lives in the faith houses as well as on film.
Thank you. That reminds me of a quote from Disclosure towards the end where is it? I have it right up here. Of course, where Laverne Cox says, "We always have to be skeptical when a few people are elevated and the majority of people are still struggling."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And oh yeah, you want to respond?
I'm sorry. This is the hard part. I was going to echo that point and say that, I love Disclosure. I think it's a great documentary, but we're just at the beginning of telling trans stories, and this is a Hollywood story. And one of the difficult things about watching this movie as a trans person is like, oh, I sure wish I looked like those Hollywood superstars. I wonder what, like, the experience of a trans person is not universal. The opinions of trans people are not universal. And Hollywood still pre-selects a certain type of person, trans or not, to elevate into the successful mold. So there is, like, this very real issue when you're watching this of like, these are still Hollywood success stories,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it's extremely important that these representatives of our community are making it forward, but they're still just that upper echelon. And I think that's
Yeah.
extremely important for us to recognize.
Yeah, like Laverne, like Caitlyn Jenner, you know, my book was just published back in March, Not Until You Have Walked in My Shoes. And I share many of the journeys and stories of my life, especially transitioning, that are still are not told. When I look at a documentary like Disclosure, I'm always asking the question of, do I see myself in these stories? I see stories, and they're accurate stories, but do I see myself, that person who's living this journey on a day-to-day basis? And I know that we're still just scratching the surface. So thank you for acknowledging that, Leah. I think it's important that we continue to be reminded of that, because I think it's really going to make a major difference as we move forward, as our cisgender compadres will get a better understanding of the real stories that are still not told out there.
And I think one of the dangers that is discussed about having sort of this Hollywood lens, you could call it, which is primarily a cis straight white male lens, is that you have this invention of trans characters for the benefit of cisgender, usually characters, like the character of Rayon in Dallas Buyers Club. And what it was making me think of in that discussion is there's also movies that are just produced that elevate certain trans narratives, and I worry, or my consideration is, but is that doing the same thing, like a meta thing where it's telling the story to better a cis straight, usually white audience? My feelings, for instance, about The Danish Girl is that there was a lot of what I experienced as sort of queer washing of their lesbian relationship for 20 years before that character, you know, was thinking about surgery and like before that, the story. So what I'm wondering, and I think there's a question in the chat that is related to this, is when is it necessary to be part of that community, to be part of that sort of mainstream media space? And when does it recreate a certain dynamic where our stories or the stories we want to see are being used not for our own benefit? When are trans stories being told in a way that are for trans people or that are liberational towards trans people, and when are they being told in a way that is reproducing the same power dynamics that oppress us?
Challenging question. I like the question. There's a good friend of mine down here by the name of Meg Daniels, who did a documentary on myself and 3 other trans pastors here in North Carolina that's getting some legs. PBS just picked it up and have notified her that it would be aired this fall, called Proper Pronouns. And she followed us for a couple of years to allow us to share portions of our story and our journey in a way that speaks to the truth that you're speaking about and surrounded by. I think that more documentaries that are being done, not from off of the Hollywood level, but with sort of a Hollywood kind of structure around it, will enable us to be able to continue to tell these stories more accurately and to reflect more vividly the actual lives and the journeys of these individuals who live this trans experience and who are going through these very journeys and being told through the mouth and the lens of these individuals who experience it.
I will just say that what I like about Disclosure is what you've pointed out, Max, which is that Sam Feder, the filmmaker, began the film from the point of view of the cover of Laverne on the cover of Time magazine did not equate to the trans folks he knew, particularly in Brooklyn at that time, who were still struggling to eat, to have a roof over their heads, to find a job where they didn't face employment discrimination. And the gap between those two things was stark. And Sam was very afraid that people would forget the history of how we got to this place of visibility by just ignoring the fact that we haven't been invisible in Hollywood media. We've been very visible in Hollywood media for over 100 years. It's just all been terrible. So he wanted to kind of address both of those things and to say, I think like Chase Strangio does at the end, that visibility for its own sake is not the goal. Visibility is only a means toward achieving like greater social equality. So 100% true that like there are lots and lots of trans folks out there creating their own media for YouTube, for web series, for all kinds of things, because the cost of production, the stakes are lower to make your own stuff that people are going to see. And that's amazing. Rain Valdez, who's in Disclosure and talks about the story about watching Soap Dish when she was a kid. She just got an Emmy nomination for her web series Razor Tongue. And that is made by her, starring her, produced by her, written by her, you know? Yeah, and it's amazing she got an Emmy nomination for it. But it's like the idea is that people are making content, but it's you know, right now doesn't have a huge platform. And so for me, I am a big believer in trying to make that huge platform better, because it hurts us when it's bad, number one. Yeah. And number two, like, I think we all know I'm a gay man in addition to being a trans man. And so one of the things we know is that people's attitudes about gay, lesbian, and bi people started to dramatically change when they met us. So I'm old. So when GLAAD was founded in the 80s, most Americans thought they didn't know someone who was gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And they just didn't know. And AIDS changed that, and a lot of things changed that. And now 90% of Americans think they know someone in their personal life who's lesbian, gay, or bisexual. So my point is what? I had one and I almost lost my thread of thought. Oh, so attitudes change when they know us personally, right? Yeah. So they estimate that there's like 1.4 million transgender Americans in the United States. I think that number is low, but let's just go with it. We could all go around and personally like knock on every door and shake someone's hand and say, hello, you've now met a trans person, please change your mind. But I'm too old for that. I'm going to die before that happens. So I want to speed things up and use the power of like the mass media to meet people in a way that's better than it was before. It's still not good. It's still not perfect by any stretch, and it still needs to be trans created. But I feel like if 10 million people plunk themselves down to watch some CBS show that has a trans character on it that is a million times better than what's been before, that those 10 million people then might feel like they've met a trans person and might then behave better when somebody in their life actually tells them, oh yes, by the way, I'm trans. Yeah. So that's kind of like the equation for me that's kept me working at GLAAD so long. There's nothing glamorous about Hollywood. It's the dirtiest business on the face of the earth. So
outside of Washington.
Yes, maybe that's true. I think Washington, D.C. might be dirtier, but Hollywood's really dirty. But it does have power. So I feel like I want to try to use that power for good by just reaching as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, with characters that seem something like an actual trans person. And then we get like, that's like the beachhead, to use a war analogy. Then we come afterwards with like our trans created content, trans people becoming showrunners in Hollywood, like all the things that also needs to happen. It's just kind of, there's a lot of work to do for me. So it's like kind of just which shovel do you want to pick up to work on digging which fence post hole, because we have a huge thing we have to build. So,
you know, it's interesting because I really do believe that with Pose and Disclosure, these two, both of them on Netflix, both of them, one is on FX. They both have drawing power, and a lot of people I know in my circle talk very vividly about Pose and everything about Pose and the effect that it's having on them. I think Disclosure is going to do the very same thing. The more mainstream viewers get to see Pose and sit in it and really rest in the history that's around it. We're in an election year, a major election year that's really going to have major ramifications on generations to come as they understand the dynamics of it all. And I keep telling, especially the young voter today, that when they understand the history, their history and where they've come from, Disclosure and Pose are doing that very thing, telling and reminding people of the history that they are connected with, that in order for them to understand where they came from and the truth around it, how it's going to play significantly going forward in the lives. So, my friend, I really hope that you continue to, through the work at GLAAD, press upon the importance of the truth that both Pose and Disclosure are attempting to do, changing the perception, the mindset, the thinking of how Hollywood and so many of the structures, whether good or bad, see us, and how we can really make a difference through these two films that have actually come out, because they're both powerful. They're both powerful.
I also want to add, Nick, I think, I think that Disclosure, so I mean, my greatest love, my longest lasting relationship is with Hollywood movies. I love the movies. It's the thing that I have loved forever. But I also, like you said, Hollywood has its issues, and the selection bias of the type of person that Hollywood is willing to elevate is more restricted, I think, that with trans people, even than it is with cis people. And that was really like what I wanted to point out. And I think another thing that's important to a conversation about a movie like Disclosure is that this is not a movie for trans people, right? I mean, I think it's wonderful, but it's an educational tool for cis people. It's an educational film. And in that way, I also do, want to recognize we're just at the beginning of this moment in which transness is becoming part of the mainstream popular presentation of American life. But what it's looking like, there's work to do. And this, of course, this is your job. You do this every day. So, but a film for, I don't think people are really nobody in Hollywood is making movies or shows for trans people. That just wouldn't be a business model that any major business is going to do. Like you said, there's only 1 million people who are probably, give or take, who are trans. So I think it's important to recognize that most media, even with trans people in it, is not made for trans people.
Yeah, that's
Definitely true. Yeah.
Justin.
I think that's absolutely true. I also wanted to name one of the things that really occurred to me while watching Disclosure was the power of trans viewership, even on these representations that were not accurate and not life-giving to us. In other words, how trans people and queer people, how our spectatorship saw ourselves and took a lifeline even from those things. So I think about being a teenager standing on a beach on a camping trip in high school, listening to a media report about Christine Jorgensen and being fascinated, even though I didn't have language yet to understand why that was so interesting to me. And then after I came out, seeing first the Brandon Tina story, the documentary about Brandon Tina, and then Boys Don't Cry. And at least I was seeing someone like me, and that was really powerful. And I want to sort of name the strength and the creativity and the innovativeness of trans and queer people to survive by even taking those awful images and finding a way to see ourselves and hold ourselves fast in the middle of them. And then, if I could pivot a sec, I also thought, one of the, I think is a point that you made, Nick, sort of rounding up some of those images of the ways in which Hollywood films have taught us to be objects of ridicule and have really set this narrative of either we cause people to vomit or we cause people to laugh. And, you know, I'm thinking, viewing this movie as a theologian, I want to say how pointing those things out and the dehumanizing and the horrifying aspects of setting up other people as objects of ridicule or setting up other people as objects of disgust, that we, those of us in the religious community, I think have to take such a strong statement to say, see, this is showing why this is so dangerous to treat people poorly, and that these sort of, this systematic portrayal of people as less than, as objects of ridicule and disgust, just so fundamentally flies in the face of what we believe as people of faith and what we need to be putting forward as the minimal standard for how human beings treat one another. And I think the disclosure just showed so powerfully that critical point.
Yeah, and I also want to say, Justin, and Leigh, I'm going to contradict you a little bit, because I think probably for you, because you are a media scholar and a media content creator, it may have been a lot of stuff you already know in disclosure. But I did take a young trans woman to see it who's in her mid-20s, and she left it in tears because she said to me, since I transitioned several years ago, I haven't wanted to hang out with other trans people. And I never really understood why until I watched this movie, because her own head was filled with all of that, like, trans people are weird, trans people are gross, trans people are disgusting, trans people should be ridiculed. She learned that from growing up. And Justin, I agree. I think we have a lot of resilience. And I love the way Disclosure and Sam's doing, really troubled the waters of not making everything, you know, either purely evil or purely good. Like, things are complicated, and people took things away from those horrible talk shows that, you know, are so sensationalistic and freak shows, circus sideshow type of horror shows, but they could still take something away from that. But then I think there's people also probably in our community who weren't resilient and who grew up watching all those things and were filled with so much self-loathing that they're not here anymore.
Absolutely.
Because when we say most Americans don't know a trans person, I may say this in the movie, forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but that means that, like, we don't know a trans person either when we're growing up and when we're in a family of cis people. And so, like, where do we go to get that knowledge about ourselves? TV. What a horrible place to go, right? And thank God now for the YouTube and the internet. So I also run a support group in LA for families with trans kids, and have for 11 years. And those kids are able to go onto YouTube and find other trans youth talking about their transition, something that certainly was not the case when I was a child, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. But, and that's wonderful that they have this alternative media path and social media or YouTube to connect with other trans people. And at the same time, their parents aren't watching those YouTube channels. Their schoolmates aren't watching those YouTube channels. Their teachers, their ministers at church. So that one-to-one connection that as a trans person you can make with something like YouTube, which is great and good for you, doesn't necessarily change the world around you because your parents aren't looking at it or your friends aren't. So it is this really complicated thing, media, how we interact with it, how it forms our own opinions, how it forms the opinions of those of us around us. None of it is clean and easy by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's undeniable that it's powerful and it shapes the world we live in. So I just want it to be better, basically.
But I also think it gives separation to, or a challenge to, the church, because much of the trans community have continued to, through their lens, see the church as also part of the problem. And they see, because of Disclosure sort of lines this up with their way of thinking, to line up with their way, with what we call the clobber verses of Scripture, that continues to separate the believer from walking in their full truth, and also live authentically as a trans individual. And it makes the job of us who continue to try to practice our faith and teach the foundation of God's love into the lives of these individuals who are trying to live authentically, who are trying to live in a world that doesn't see them as whole, difficult. And when you have Hollywood for many, many decades continue to show us as anything but something to laugh at or not taking seriously, the Faith House is supporting this in many respects. And we've got to figure out how we can continue to spread the message of love and hope. And the only way we can continue to do that as advocates in the pulpit, advocates on the streets and in film, is to continue to tell stories of truth and continue to support the organizations that are doing the work of trying to advocate for housing and other aspects of one's life that is going to tear away at the fabric of these systems that have depicted us so badly for so long.
There was so I'm going to talk about something where I wish it was better, but it was like a little tiny spark of hope that I wish could have been more. So there was a show on CBS called God Friended Me.
Yes.
And CBS, the most conservative of the three big networks, obviously, like a very much older, very much whiter, very much mostly Republican viewing audience. This show called God Friended Me, which was about a Black minister and his children, and his queer daughter ends up leaving his church and going to this new church that's LGBT inclusive. And the minister in that church is a Black trans woman played by Peppermint. And she was only in a couple of episodes, but I mean, like, imagine a CBS audience sitting there and here's a Black trans woman as a minister on God Friended Me. And in my dream, that she's only in 2 episodes in 2020, but in my dream, we get a show that's about her and a Black trans minister. You know what I mean? Like that, we have to take a little baby steps at a time, but if only, we had that.
Yeah.
But at least they made CBS, of all the networks, at least made this little tiny effort to have a Black trans woman minister on one of their shows, which I can't.
And they did another show as well that was on CBS for such a short window of time. The show eludes me, but he served as an attorney on the show, and I thought it was powerful. But again, we're just getting the trickle effects.
Yeah.
Of change, right now, which is a good thing. It may not happen in my lifetime or your lifetime, but we know that change is coming, and it's encouraging. It really is encouraging.
So, and I have one last question, and then we'll open up to audience questions. But I think, seeing how I can relate it, I'll just ask the question. You'll relate it. Okay. Let's see. So there's this recently in Twitter and online sort of come out that, or there's been articles like The Matrix is a trans story, and both the Wachowskis have come out as trans. Leigh Wachowski was in the film. Disclosure points to some of my favorite icons like Bugs Bunny. Existing in this sort of fictional or really, well, cartoonish and then sci-fi, as well as the character from Sense8 that they talk about in Disclosure. And I'm bringing this up because a lot of my research is in fiction and how do we tell trans and non-binary myths and fictions to affect change. What do those do? And so my question is more, for me, fun, but hopefully for you, fun. What is the role of sort of outside of realism or thinking in the fictional, the magical, the science fictional? What is the role of that in sort of trans speaking culture? Acknowledging that part of the dehumanizing treatment of trans people has said that they're not human, they're magical and other. curious what the role of sort of, myth and sci-fi and all that magical goodness might be in the work of trans liberation.
You're speaking my language, Max, but I'm gonna let everybody else answer first.
Well, I mean, I think it's humongous. The answer is it is huge. It is huge to be able to imagine a world, where restrictive boundaries are non-existent. I mean, there is no doubt. I was not out from 1999 when The Matrix arrived, but there is no doubt I was drawn to that story for reasons I'm not sure I knew at the time. Just like, Lily said in the film, like she didn't have language for the thing that she was expressing, but it was there, and now she could look back and say that's what was happening here. So I think it's beyond the capacity to state how important metaphor and analogy and being able to explore queerness in stories, or whether or not you're queer. One of my favorite books when I was I've read a lot of science fiction, and one of my favorite early books was Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, which is a world where people change their genders as necessary to reproduce, and it was mind-blowing to me, and I just think that you can't overstate what happens when people encounter fictional worlds that allow them to explore who they are and what the world is and how the world works, and justice and injustice, and it is, the history of humanity is written in this way, so it's not particularly insightful, but it's also like you can never overstate it, I think.
And I think for me, that part of the power of the world's rich history of narrative is that it shows us that people have been asking questions about gender and have been living in ways that complexify gender in ways we're only starting to sort of, I think, really get into in the modern age for a very long time. That this is part of humanity's wider story, and that there's a lot of truth in myth. Even if we know that a coyote and a raven did not have an actual conversation, we know that stories about that tell true things, right? And I think part of the truth that we see is just the richness of how human culture has configured genders or chosen not to configure genders for a very long time. That we're part of the story of what it means to be a human being.
I like the art of imagination. And film and television takes me there from time to time. But I'm so fascinated when I look at young children because they have such vivid imaginations. And I can only wonder what it was like in my childhood years of imagining, just transforming into whatever character that my mind at the time would imagine. I know that in my transformation process, there have been individuals whom I have had the pleasure of either knowing or seeing, and in the process of developing, I've taken on portions of those individuals. I've allowed my imagination to create all of who Deborah is and live in that truth, because I know from the Creator that we were created in the Creator's image. And when I do the imaginative version of that, I'm taken back to the one film that just stands out. It's called it's the movie called The Shack. I read the book many years ago, but then they produced the film, and it was a very powerful film that depicted God in different forms. And who's to say that that I may have been born male and transitioned as I moved along in life into this budding flower of a female, to serve the very same purpose and make a difference in the world that we live in. I just allow that face of imagination to really take hold from the time I get up in the morning to the time I go out into the world. I let that imagination just run through me to be all that I can be, and hope that everything around me, whether it's in film or in television and in the church or wherever I'm at, just transform into that beauty as well. Because that's how I see the world at some point in time, and hope and pray that it gets there.
Well, I can't possibly top that statement, Deborah. That was really beautiful. And I was just going to say I'm a giant nerd and I love sci-fi. So, you know, but, you know, I literally grew up on Star Trek. You know, it's my favorite franchise. Love every incarnation of it. And yet, like, for me, what was frustrating was it was like Star Trek is the future where we're all super diverse and, you know, people can have all these different roles that they can't have on Earth. We have a Black woman who's the navigator and an Asian American man who's the, you know, and yet there were no queer people to be seen in Star Trek for 60 years, 55 years, something like that, as if we did not exist in the future. So it was such a hypocritical, like, gap that series never solved, until they finally, with Discovery, added well, I will back up. They never addressed it except metaphorically. So you would have these weird episodes like The Outcast, or weird episodes where it's a trill, but Dr. Crusher can't be in love with him because now he's a woman. Oh, you know, and so it took until Discovery for them to actually put concrete gays in space on Star Trek that actually were gay men. So I like the way that science fiction can indulge in metaphor and analogy and imagination and creativity around things like gender, and Left Hand of Darkness is an excellent example of that. But I also want to see us manifest in the future as if we're not somehow wiped out by some genetic cataclysm in 2 years. So I'm all for sci-fi bringing us in. The challenges with like movies is those have to play internationally and they're huge budgets and they don't want to take any risks. And TV is less risky for them, and so they're starting to put us into genre shows. But it's very rare, and when I say us, I mean mostly LGBT, not a lot of trans. And if you like sci-fi, I confess I haven't read the whole anthology because I don't have time to read books anymore. But I'm going to put a link in the chat that is to a book called Meanwhile Elsewhere, and it was published by Topside Press.
I know it.
Yeah.
I know it.
Topside Press is like a trans press, basically. And this anthology is short stories all by trans writers, and they're all sci-fi genre short stories. So I've read some of them, but not all of them. So if you like that sort of thing, this is a whole book of short stories just by trans people that are sci-fi and fantasy.
I'm so reminded of the 60s when the Beatles came on the scene, and they had one particular song, Imagine All the People. When we talk about equality, fair justice in this world in which we live in, as we move forward collectively in our respective areas, imagine all the people living in this world. Oh, my mind is just out there right now. Great possibilities.
Thank you so much. That's so much. Y'all are so wonderful. I'm gonna look at that. At Meanwhile Elsewhere after this, but before that, did you have something to say, Leigh?
I was just going to say, I wanted to echo what Nick was saying about the limits of metaphor, right? I grew up loving the X-Men. The X-Men is a very explicit metaphor for queerness in a lot of ways, but there is a limit to me wanting to be a mutant. You know, there is a point at which my genre is horror. I love horror.
No.
And that is, but we're just starting to see like horror has always been a playground for queer metaphor, but now we're starting to see literal queer horror, and that's very exciting to me. Like, I want to see queer people in the horror movies, not just metaphors where they end up like dead, you know.
Right. Or the psychotic killer like Sleepaway Camp.
Yeah, or that's not even a metaphor. That's just trash.
Yeah, that's just straight up transphobia. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's really exciting to me, and I do think that there does reach a point at which we say, like, okay, it would also be good for people to see human versions of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Leah, sci-fi. I would rather see more drama, simply because in my imaginative mind, I want our stories to be told more truthfully. I think sci-fi in some ways continues to tell the audience or put the audience in this fantasy world of, within the back of their mind, oh, this isn't really happening, this isn't really true. But I think in drama, with true life stories, where we're actually allowed to be ourselves and play these roles, I think will at some point in time in the future have major effects on the lives of others. I know what sci-fi does, takes us into this imaginative world, but I really think drama would have a powerful message going forward for us.
And I just want to say really quick, Max, because I know you want to get to questions. I don't think it's a competition. I think we need it all. And we really desperately need a comedy. We need a comedy where people are laughing with us, not
With
at
us.
us.
Yeah.
And we haven't had that yet, really, that I can think of off the top of my head, hardly at all. And I'm not the world's biggest Will and Grace fan. Do not get me wrong. That show is flawed in a number of ways. But it was a sitcom that allowed mainstream Americans who thought they didn't know anybody gay to laugh with gay people, not at gay people. And when we have something like that is with trans people, I think that's going to also be really game changing. So I'm just for trans representation in everything, in every genre, including horror, including everything, because you reach different audiences and each one of those types of genres has different impacts.
And I was going to say that part of what I generally am not even a TV watcher, and I love Pose. I'm such a fan. And part of what I love about Pose is, even though there's a lot of tragedy in it and it's a drama, there are moments where there's this the joy and the love that the characters have is the source of their resilience in the middle of that. And for people to see that trans people and trans people of color in particular live lives from a wellspring of love is, I think, part of what's really powerful about that. And you can laugh with them at their foibles and interpersonal dramas, but there is a core of this really deep joyfulness that allows the characters to face the tragedies they face. And I think that's part of what makes that show feel very real to me, because that has been true for people in my life as well.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful, wonderful point to make. I am waiting for a story to come out that is about how being a trans person means you get to build your own life, and it is the most creative and wonderful, and it's just an explosion of creativity. It is the most incredible sense of how to live your life. But there's been no story that's just been like, this is beautiful and wonderful and joyful, and let's celebrate it. I mean, Pose is the closest thing, for sure, that I've seen doing that.
And I think that's so theologically. Sorry, Max, we're hijacking your panel. But I think Leigh, what you're saying, this idea of being co-creators of our life and discerning for ourselves, listening to the truth of the voice inside of us, and saying, who am I called to be, and how do I build that one piece at a time in my own body, my spirit, my mind? How do I build that community around me? Is this incredible God-given talent, I think, that we have, and it should be celebrated as a thing, not just some side way in which we get to live, but that's part of the gifts that we bring to the world.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the Jack Halberstam's book that came out a couple years ago, one of the things he does is talk about the Lego movie in relation to trans experience. And again, that's a metaphor, but that exact thing that you're talking about, of the power of building yourself, your world, of not saying there's this one sort of quote quote natural system and that's it, and if you're out of that you're wrong, but saying that we're all in processes, we're all building. And I agree it would be great to have that story and maybe a more explicitly trans way than the Lego movie, though however Sam seemed pretty clear it was explicit.
Yeah, no shade for the Lego movie, but yeah, I agree.
So folks who have been listening in, you have some questions, and Jennifer, would you be able to help moderate that, just because there's a lot of people, a lot of text?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hello, thanks everyone. This has been such a great conversation. I know that, so folks now are welcome. I think you could post questions in the chat is probably the best way to do it, just so that we can, there's always the awkward Zoom timing thing of people trying to jump in at the same time. So if you have questions now, throw them in the chat. I was just gonna scroll up and look at Anne had been posting some questions along the way. So I was going back and like, bye Demian, thanks. Lots of good comments.
I saw one of them that said, "Can you think of any comedies?" And I was like,
Tangerine.
kinda. There were funny parts of Tangerine. Not that funny though.
A little bit of Sex in the City, maybe. Little bit. I know Disclosure had a segment of Sex in the City in it as well.
I know, but it was really so offensive. It was really bad. Oh,
I know.
Transparent, but it makes me sad every time it makes
I know. Well, it's kind of like a cringe comedy in a way, and I'm not a big fan of cringe comedy. And it was very also mixed. It was like a dramedy in a way. So no, I can't really think of a straight up like laugh out loud. There's some independent things that have been made. You know, Razor Tongue, for example, is dark. What did you say, Leigh?
Priscilla, that's an older one, but that's pretty funny.
You know, and for its time, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert was really groundbreaking, and really that character of Bernadette was really well written in a lot of ways. But you had Terrence Stamp playing Bernadette, and Terrence Stamp was, if you were old, very well known, straight, heterosexual, cisgender, macho-y kind of actor. So it was still this happens a lot with those older characters that were well written and meant to be empathetic, were undercut by the casting. So you had John Lithgow in The World According to Garp and Terrence Stamp in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And so you kind of want to like these characters, even Philip Seymour Hoffman in Flawless, you know, those kinds of movies. And yet it's reinforcing this narrative that trans women just take it all off at the end of the movie and they go back to being men again. So it was one of those things that's not clearly good or evil, but more mixed.
But what is good or evil, right? One of the things I like about Disclosure is that, can't remember who says it, maybe Candace, but, you know, I like her. I love Silence of the Lambs, right? Like these things exist and they exist in the world and they are problematic and we can look at them, but we can also, like, I also love Priscilla. And I know that that's true, but I also know 1984, you know, it was or 88 or whenever that was made. And I think it's important to recognize that we have to criticize the work that is failing, but also we can love these stories and they have meant so much to people. Like we said this earlier, but just coming back to it.
I mean, Jen Richards talks about how towards the end of the film, there's all these horrible representations, but would I also be able to articulate who I am and come into being without these representations? And I really resonate with that of just like that mix that I
Yeah, if you're looking for comedy with some taste towards it, the reflection that I got from Milton Berle back in the day and Flip Wilson was to laugh at themselves playing the transgender character. I didn't take too much of an offense to it in my young mind at the time. And even as I think back on it today, I just find laughter and humor in it, in a way of laughing at ourselves in a entertaining way and nothing derogatory.
Thank you. So we do have a question from Stephanie. I can share with, I mean, you all can read yourselves and I'll share from the chat. So she wanted to build on Leigh's comment, and Stephanie's curious about what specific story or even mundane moments you wish were being told in movies and TV right now, maybe specifically from your own experience, if you're comfortable, whether it be directly related to trans identity or not. So we'll have the pitch, actor, genre, soundtrack. Let's cast a vision here for what's possible, what we'd like to see.
Do you want me to answer really quick while you think, Leigh?
I mean, this is for everyone. Yes.
Well, I will do something. I'll say something really quick, and that'll give everybody else time to think, because that's a pop quiz kind of question. There is a movie coming out this fall. It's called The True Adventures of Wolf Boy, and it's a feature film. And it stars John Turturro's in it, Chloe Sevigny, and 2 child actors. And the film was written by a transgender woman. And there's very, 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 very few feature films written by a trans person. You can practically count them on one hand that have gotten any sort of theatrical distribution at all outside of the festival circuit. So this movie, The True Adventures of Wolf Boy, one of the things I tell Hollywood is no more transition narratives. Like, stop writing transition narratives. Jesus Christ. Sorry, it's a seminary. I'm so sorry. I did not mean to swear. It's so reductive to reduce everything about being trans to puberty. Like, it just sticks us like a bug in amber in time. You never get it right. There's literally nothing about trans people who are thinking about transitions. Don't stare in mirrors typically forever. Like, that's the opposite of what we want to do. Stop showing us looking sad in mirrors. So frustrating the way cisgender people approach transition narratives. Bad. It's universally bad. The Danish Girl is a perfect example. So this movie, The True Adventures of Wolf Boy, written by a trans woman, is 100% a transition narrative, but it's all from the inside out. It's all about the emotions that you feel as you consider whether or not you're going to transition, the fear and everything else. And it is told in metaphor, because it is about a literal wolf boy, who, by the way, looks not unlike Max. A face literally full of hair. If you just had some on your forehead, Max, you would have it covered. So he's like 14 years old. He's a literal wolf boy. He's filled with self-loathing. He is afraid he'll never have anybody love him. He's afraid he'll be a freak forever. So he runs away and joins the circus, and the circus master is cruel to him, blah, blah, blah. Then he runs away from the circus, burns it down, and meets a young trans girl. So the wolf boy is the metaphor for transness, but he also meets an actual trans girl played by a trans actress. And she's also like 14, and she's perfectly fine with herself. Her mother's not accepting, but she knows exactly who she is. She's already found community. She's not afraid. And she befriends him, and she goes on this journey with him while he's trying to overcome his own internalized sense of self-loathing. And she's kind of like, get your shit together, man. I'm here. I'm cool. We'll be friends once you work all your drama out. But the emotions that are embedded in the wolf boy felt so real to me as a trans person. That feeling like, who will love me? Will I ever have a life? Will anyone ever accept me? And there's a moment, and that's not spoiling anything, but toward the end of the movie, the wolf boy gets to meet his grandfather, who also has the wolf man gene. And the one thing he gets to ask his grandfather is, how hard will my life be? Which I think for queer people is something we worry about, and we don't have anybody in our family to ask typically. Like, there are no queer elders around us when we're little to ask, like, how hard's my life gonna be? And the grandfather says, it's gonna be really hard, but you're gonna live through it. And so this trans woman wrote this feature film. So this is the type of trans content I wanna see. This is what a transition narrative looks like when trans people tell it. It's not about looking in mirrors and taking shots and feeling bad about your body and It's about this fear of like, what am I about to do? How will the world treat me? Will I be able to have a future and a life? And she infused that into this movie so beautifully. So that's what I want to see more of, is films like that. And it's finally going to come out this fall sometime. So now everybody else can talk about what they want to see. Hopefully giving you time to think about it. Because I cheated, talked about something that's already coming. Oh, you're on mute, Leigh. Unmute. Leigh, unmute.
Oh, shoot. Well, that definitely sounds like my jam. So thank you for bringing it up. Yeah. But I also want to see, I want to see a movie where, like, I'm a parent. I want to see a movie or a TV show, running sitcom or whatever, where one of the parents is trans, right? Or where you have trans people, like what I'm personally in search of at this moment anyways, is stories that have trans characters who are a part of the fabric of a community, who are not tormented characters and who are not depressed characters and who are not whose demise is not ancillary, just part of life, right? Is a part of the world. There's a another movie that's sort of in my world called Assassination Vacation from a couple years ago, which is like a horror movie where a group of young high school girls like kill all the people in their town.
Assassination Nation.
Nation, yes. Thank you. It's nonsense, but it has a beautiful performance by a beautiful trans woman, and that is not central to the plot. It's just a like, oh, there are people who are trans and they can be in stories. And that's really what I'm craving right now. And I think it has to do with partially with like, I have young children and I want them to know, like, there's not one trans person on earth who happens to be their maca, It's like, there are people in the world, and I wish they were in books and stories, and they could see that that is the way it is.
There are two things I want to mention. One is, you talked about parents, but, after I left the National Center for Transgender Equality, they made this short video called Introduction to Transgender People. And in it, there are several families who have young transgender children. And I wish there were a narrative version of this is a little like, you show it when you're doing a Trans 101 talk and it blows people's mind. But here's the revolution I think that's been so powerful in the last decade or so, is that young children at the age in which they're aware of being trans, 3, 4, their parents believe them. Their pediatricians believe them. Their pastors believe them, right? Not everyone. There are many, many children whose lives we have to save and we have to talk about. But the fact that there is this story, or I did a program and I had done research into trans lives and this and the discrimination we face. And this grandfather came up to me and said, my granddaughter is trans. Like you have to tell me how to stop this discrimination from happening. So those stories of families who fiercely love and believe their children is so powerful to me. And I would love to see those stories told. And I also just wanted to say that I want to keep seeing things like the brilliant thing that was done on the Katie Couric show, the things that Laverne Cox and other people have done, which is to pivot from, oh, you want to sensationalize me? Let me tell you about the realities of trans people. Let me tell you about the ways in which racism compounds transphobia to an exponential level of, of discrimination and violence. I want to show the courage of people who keep pivoting those stories, so that when we, I guess that's not exactly like a film or a narrative that I'm pitching, but I guess more trans people to feel genuinely empowered to say like, oh, you gave me a mic, I'm going to tell you the thing that matters. And the thing that matters is preserving the lives of our community, our children, our adults, our seniors, and whatever platform you give me, that's what I'm pitching.
Well, you saved me for last, I guess. It's interesting because as I was listening to all of you, I was sitting here thinking about how parents have to wean their children from one stage of their lives to the next stage, whether it's from the bottled milk to solid food to that steak. And I think I'm seeing the country through film pretty much doing the same thing. There are a couple of shows on television right now, sitcoms that are on television right now that have gay themes to it and conversations within the family setting. And I'm sitting in that because as I see it transform going forward or transition going forward, I can see some of these young transgender actors and actresses playing significant roles in the family context, telling stories of how to live in this world and how to navigate in this world, whether it be getting a job or education or what have you. I'm slowly seeing that transition, and I hope it will continue to move forward, especially during these times that is pressing this subject forward at a more rapid pace. And I think that it's a weaning of the country into these narratives that are really going to be able to tell more profound stories, whether on the comedic level, documentary level, drama level, whatever genre it's going to show up in through music or what have you. I'm starting to see that transition.
So we're coming towards our time, but I also think this is a really good question.
Just having fun. We got time.
Yeah, can we do one more question? I think actually we can tie Anne's question into this one too from previously. So perfect, tied up with a beautiful bow. So Theo's question is, what is something that you would like to see younger trans and folks doing or paying attention to when it comes to critiquing or commenting on film and television or contributing to the visual arts? And Theo says, this is such an amazing panel. Thank you so much. Anne's question previously, which thank you, Anne, for reposting it because there were so many great comments that I could trying to go through. Anne was asking about if anyone on the panel knows about support or particular funding that's available for building trans narrative through art and film. So earlier in the conversation, you all had talked about how, you know, there's this tension between the importance of kind of the having the microphone right on the national scale through Hollywood and so on. But so are there opportunities that you're aware of or things that you could recommend maybe in independent funding or other avenues of funding that might be a way to get around that and create their own narrative? So that's kind of a two-parter, maybe a practical, what are resources that we could recommend? And also, what are you hoping for kind of upcoming generations? Does that capture it? It's a great question.
Very quickly, when it comes to, because I spend a lot of time around our younger generations, because I'm always conscious of the fact of trying to bridge the divide. And what I would like to see our younger generation as they navigate through all of this is to understand their history, understand the path that got them to where they are today. There are so many today from yesterday, such as from the Stonewall uprising back in the late 1960s. Even further than that, there's so much history. I equate it to when I talk about to our young people the importance of this year's election, and that they need to understand that monuments and plaques did nothing to me as an African American, but a system that has been in place. And if we understand our history, going as far back as the Declaration of Independence and the promise that was made in that one paragraph, if we understand the history, then we would know that as we engage in the processes of today, whether it be in film, whether it be voting for a particular candidate or getting involved in the political process, that if we understand the history, we will know the battles in which we need to be really directing our energies to fight up against, to break the system that is out there for that has denied us the freedoms and the rights that we continue to struggle towards. And so I hope that they will engage in understanding the history as we move forward. There's an organization, very quickly, and I'll get out of the way, out of New York City called Borealis. They work with trans-led nonprofit organizations in a genre of areas that will help fund nonprofit organizations, whether it be in film, activism work, but as long as they're trans-led and it is a nonprofit organization, this is an organization that has several levels within them. The Trans Justice Fund, just to name the two that are connected with each other. but separate entities that will provide funding. Borealis, Philanthropies, and the Trans Justice Funds are two areas that will help in the film and arts industry as well, as long as they're trans-led.
And I would say, as far as what folks should pay attention to, you know, I think this younger generation, right? You know, I'm so impressed with the level of leadership and the crafting of their own lives.
Yes.
You know, and the emergence of non-binary folks and then young trans people coming out. I'm so in awe of your leadership and the work that's being done. And I want to echo what Reverend Hopkins said, Deborah, that you talked about the you know, honoring the history that came before and recognize that when we were making content in the past, when we were writing books, when we were doing all kinds of things, a lot of us were doing it in isolation, and we were doing those things, like recognizing things that were groundbreaking for their time, even if they're not reflective now, and thinking of this as like a giant foundation for our liberation that we're all building, and you get to build like a lot of cool stuff on top of it. And I really am in awe and looking forward to seeing the cool stuff that you will build on top of that. And so I think sort of, you know, balancing those generations. And I guess what part of the question was critiquing and commenting. I want to say the part of what I thought was powerful about Disclosure was that it showed a rich racial diversity, gender diversity of the folks that are on there. That is the reality of who trans people are and who the queer people are. And if we don't hold ourselves to the standard of telling the truth about who we are, and that if we're not including all of those stories, we are not telling trans stories accurately. And I think like holding our community, holding people who talk about us, all of these things to the standard of saying we are going to tell the truth about who we are, and our community is incredibly diverse, and that is our strength, and that we have to stand for those in our community who get marginalized, targeted, against human acts of violence and discrimination are committed, and that when you do it to one of us, you do it to all of us, and we have to stand solid with that and tell our truths. And I hope you keep holding us and everyone else to that standard.
I'm inspired by the energy and the crossing of the lines of the different cultures and race and genders that are banding together to support a body of people, whether we identify as gay or lesbian, transgender, gender nonconforming, queer. It's impressive and is encouraging to me. I saw some of this in the 60s, but not on the level that I'm seeing it today, where so many are coming across lines and standing together for the cause of equality. And if we're going to have positive images on film, in our storybooks and other aspects of life, whether it be the political spectrum, it's coming from this generation that has come together with an energy and a passion of change. And I'm also supportive and so encouraged by this action that I'm looking at. It's so promising.
I'll go next, and I'll say that those two questions are kind of related in a way, and I think that you know, Tinseltown has that name for a reason, and it seems very glamorous, but as I said before, it's a really dirty business in a dirty town. So if you want to make media as a young person or as any age person, I think you really, if you want to do it within the world of Hollywood and mainstream media, quote unquote, you have to really, really, really want to do it. And it is a 24/7, like, thankless job that is very difficult to do, because, you know, Hollywood right now is divided into big budget superhero movies and everything else, especially when it comes to film. And that everything else is about this big, which is to say not much at all. I mean, Sam Feder spent 5 years raising the money to make Disclosure, and it was a drop in the bucket budget that wouldn't even be craft services on an Avengers movie. And it took him 5 years to raise that money from a variety of different sources. So it was 5 years of going around with a pitch document, knocking on every door everywhere, just trying to raise this little tiny bit of money. And so if you think of yourself as a creator and you want to make things, there's lots of ways to make things in your local community, for your local media, for your church, for your school, for your whatever, and just stay away from Hollywood. If you want to come to Hollywood and make stuff, be ready to work hard for almost no reward. Because if you're toiling away in the trenches, like especially making low budget feature films or documentaries, extremely difficult. And no, there's no funding for that, like not easy funding. You can go around, like I said, in the grants and foundations and Good Doc and this and that and the other thing, and hope you find a rich person that wants to write you a check, and then they write you that check knowing they're never going to get their money back. It's basically a charitable donation. So that's what the world of Hollywood funding looks like right now for small budget, under $2 million movies, let's say. And it's rough. It's really, really, really rough. And the people who do it are passionate. I have a cohort here that I run, co-run, for trans masculine people working in Hollywood. And there's about 90 people on there, and they're all trying to work their way up through the writer's room system, through the this, to the that, to in this diversity fellowship. And I don't know how they pay rent, because it is, is it rough. And that was before COVID. So, it's really difficult, and there's not easy funding sources for independent creative media that I'm aware of for that level. And it is a lot of you have to really, really, really be passionate about it if that's what you want to do. But there's other ways to make great media that isn't in this town. So you can do it in all kinds of amazing ways and have impact on the people in your immediate vicinity that isn't going to end up necessarily on CBS or whatever. So that's what I would say is, like, don't let that stop you from doing it, but be clear in your mind what you want to do. Do you want to just make art because you love it and you want to make it for the people around you? But if you want to go fight your way into the system, no, it's really a hard slog. And really quickly, in terms of like critique, yes, like looking at holding not only trans community accountable for being intersectional, like Justin was talking about, but also holding the media content creators accountable and saying, we don't want to just see whatever it is, trans people who look like cis people, people who have pretty privilege, people who don't have disabilities, people who are older, people who are younger, like the diversity within the trans community is so three-dimensional chess, I usually describe it as, and media hasn't even come close to scratching the surface of that yet. And even disclosure fell short, I would say, on non-binary representation. So Terrell Anderson and Sarah Enzo Otegi are in the film, and they're both non-binary, and it wasn't from lack of trying, which I know is no excuse, but circumstances, and it probably doesn't talk about non-binary issues enough, and there's room to grow on that front. So, but especially holding those people who really have the power accountable and saying, we want diverse trans representation. We want all ages, people with disabilities, intersectional identities, and hold them accountable to do it, so that we don't just get the same trans people all the time, basically. It's the type of trans people, I should say.
I mean, I don't really have anything to add to what has been said here. I think trans people should continue building their own lives in the world and continuing to tell the stories of what those lives look like and mean. I mean, that's what everybody here is here to talk about. That's what everyone in Disclosure is trying to do. It's very hard to do if you want to make stories. Nick was just talking about this. I'm currently trying to raise a teeny amount of money, and it's a lot of work. But it's also like, who cares? Money. Don't let money discourage. Money is the dumbest thing we ever thought up. Don't let it discourage you from doing the thing you want to do. But yeah, so everybody has covered this. Continue being the most incredible version of humanity that I think anyone has ever been.
Yeah, the nice thing is, if you really don't care about trying to make a movie with $2 million budget or whatever, like these cameras are better than most Hollywood cameras. You can just literally pick up your phone and make something. And that is a level of accessibility that we've never had in the history of humanity before, that you could literally shoot a film on your phone. And people have done it. Like Tangerine, for example, was shot on iPhones. So there is also the mixed thing of, like, you can also make your own stuff for nothing on your phone. And sometimes that'll catch the imagination of the bigger mainstream media, and you'll get that story out there. It won't work every time, but it could work sometimes. And that's really exciting.
Well, I
The
think
key is to get the message out. Someone's going to eventually bite on it, whether it's a small audience or the giants in Hollywood. The point is just getting the message out there, and that's the important part. The struggle is difficult and can weigh on us heavily, but we must persevere. If we're ever going to get to the other side, we need to continue to persevere. Share the story, let the message be heard, and let people know that we're still here and we're not going away.
that is a great place to end this panel. Clearly, we need to have more panels, more conversation. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, all the panelists, for your amazing answers and all the really wonderful questions tonight. Yeah, this was really great. You all-
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the
you.
invitation. It
Thank
was,
you
it was
so
wonderful
much.
to spend an hour
Thank
with
you,
you all.
Max.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Blessings on all of you. Continue to do what you do best. Make a difference.
Thank
Be a
you.
voice for change. God
Thanks,
bless you.
Deborah
Amen.
Hopkins.
Love you.
Bye.
Oh.
I was going to leave meeting, but then I just thought, oh, maybe I'll just say hi.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, you could stop recording if you want.
Oh, I probably should. Yeah.
Oh, Jennifer, what are you going to say?
Yeah. It's gonna be